when we talked about a presentation, I just got this book. This book is, I think, fairly new. It's from the Royal Astronomical Society. When I renewed my membership last time, I noticed that they now had published this book. This book is called Building a Small Observatory, Lessons from Builders. As a matter of fact, if I hit the right button, there it is. So this is a really good book. And it's a sampling of observatories, as it says, 140 small observatories in 10 countries, and how they built it. And what's really cool about observatories that amateurs build is that they really vary. They run the gamut of different types and different, all sorts of creative ways to put a building together. It's amazing what people can do with just a few basic themes. So what I wanted to do tonight is show you the few basic themes and show you a few things that people have done for the various types of observatories, and then show you how I built mine, and then maybe share some of the pitfalls that people run into, that I've run into, and then we can ask around. I think there's a few people in the room here who have their own observatories. So I would definitely suggest, if you're interested, pick up this book. It's a mere $17.95, so it's decent. It's not one of these $40 books, and you can enjoy that. When I was a kid, I think I kept this book, not this copy, but this book in circulation in Monroe Library for about 20 years, because I kept taking it out. Probably the only one who took it out. This is a book by Patrick Moore called Astronomical Telescopes and Observatories for Amateurs, and it was kind of the one book that had all of the stuff that really, I really enjoyed, like telescopes and observatories, and I would read this book and I'd dream about my own observatory that I'd have one day. It's a little dated now, but it's still pretty good. It talks about telescope types that you don't see that much anymore, but certainly it's still topical. I'll talk about that one later. So this is a good book. Get it, read it, enjoy it. So why would you have an observatory? Well, the reason I have an observatory is if I had to lug all my stuff out into the backyard, I wouldn't do it very often. We have a very busy life with a couple of teenagers, and the fact that I can walk out into my shed and 5 minutes later I'm doing what I want to do means that I actually do it. If I had to lug all my stuff out into the backyard every single time and put it back, it would be a lot harder to motivate myself to actually do it, and I'd probably end sooner because I'd have that long process of getting everything packed up. So basically right now I walk out to my shed, I open it up, I can start doing my thing. When I feel like stopping, I close it up and I go back inside. Very easy. It means that you'll actually do it more. I don't risk breaking my equipment and breaking my cables and all that stuff, plugging it, not plugging it. As you can see from the kind of rat's nest I've got around the telescope there's a lot of stuff to plug in my setup. So if I had to tear it down and put it back up every time, things would get busted. Having power right there is wonderful. Having a network setup that works every single time is wonderful. Actually, doing alignments, especially polar alignments, and never having to touch them again is truly wonderful. And it just means that you're up and running right away, right? And of course, I got a place to store my stuff that isn't getting in the way. So should I be not walking around there? Probably, right? So that's why you'd have an observatory of your very own. So, of course, there's observatories and there's varying degrees of observatories. So we'll start at the absolute simplest and go from there. So one thing that people do is they just leave their stuff out, they cover it up, and they'd stand up all the time, they'd walk up to it, uncover it, use it, and cover it up again, and you're done. This is generally people who live in Arizona or somewhere, right? Because they can't. You can in Manitoba in the summer kind of thing, or in the spring or in the fall. So there are ways to get a sort of semi-permanent setup also by building a little enclosure around your scope so that it's a sort of mini observatory. It protects it, keeps people out of it, keeps the critters out of it, and it's ready to use at any time. There are some commercial systems that you can buy that you can cover your scope with. This is a Biffy tent from Walmart, which works really well. So it's a privacy tent for, you know, if you've got a chemical toilet or something. So that seems to have worked very well for this guy. Keeps the rain off. So the cover is potentially the first thing. Some people have used just fixed sheds, garden sheds, and they put their stuff in there, and when they want to observe, they take it out. Nice thing is that it's outside, so you don't have to lug it down the stairs and all over your garden. Plus, you have a place to store your stuff. On the flip side, it doesn't give you any protection. Well, it gives you some protection from the elements because you can sit in there while your telescope's doing stuff. But it's generally not something you can see the stars from and still give you some protection. So you still have to wheel out and assemble your stuff. Harder to critter-proof and weatherproof, but hey, better than nothing. And it gets you out under the stars quicker. The next thing is a roll-off shed, and when you start thinking about like the Club Dobsonian, for example, this or the next slide is something that you might want to consider, because what this is you have a stationary telescope. For example, this one's on a pier. It's an SCT on a pier, right? So it's not going anywhere. It's bolted to the concrete, and the actual shed slides off and slides backwards and gets out of the way. So now you have the full sky visible to you at all times. You have no protection from the weather unless you go sit in your shed, but it's a great way to leave your telescope completely set up. It's easier to critter-proof. You get some weather protection when you're not using the telescope, obviously. The problems are, if you're doing this in Manitoba, you have to figure out a way to keep those rails free of ice and snow, which is usually a terminal problem for these kind of things, unless you put some sort of electric warmers on them to keep them free of ice and snow. But there are other alternatives. This fella in Montreal has a fold-off shed, which he stores his telescope on the pad right here. I couldn't find a picture where he had his telescope on it. And this just flips up, right? So there's no rails, and as you can see, it's fine in the snow. You have to get to it. But once you get to it, you just maybe shovel a little bit in the back. You can flip it up, and you can use the telescope, and when you're done, you can flip it down. And pretty critter-proof, pretty easy to secure. Just put a big padlock on it, padlock it to the cement, and you're done. So, once again, now your telescope's outside, 5 minutes and you're up and running and observing. Much better. So the next level of complexity is roll-off or run-off sheds, which is what I have. This is mine in the pictures. And basically, it's a permanently sited shed or building where the roof basically retracts. And in this particular variant, the roof is on rails. So in mine, of course, this is pointing south. This gable here is pointing south. So I wanted to be able to see my southern horizon. So this gable folds down and sits on a pin, and the entire roof rolls back. And now I have a 10 by 10 area where I can have my equipment and use my telescope. I tend to roll the roof off, then go inside, because it's all automated, but absolutely it's great for sitting outside. You get a thermocell, which we talked about on the list not too long ago, which is a mosquito killing device. I put my thermocell right there 15 minutes before I start observing. and I don't see a mosquito the entire time I'm observing. So it's great. So we're going to look at this in detail, but we'll cover a few other types of sheds. Nice thing about this is you get a full sky exposure. It's not expensive to build. It's not complex. It's easy to take care of. You've got lots of room. On the con side, really, you don't have a lot of wind protection, because if your walls are low enough to get the entire horizon, then it's probably not low enough to protect you from the wind all that much. It is a larger footprint than some, because you have the building size, in my case 10 by 10, and then you have the runoffs, which are another 10 by 10, so you double the size of the footprint of the building. But you can tell your wife that these are plant hangers.
Indeed they
And it
are.
goes good. And worst case, if you stop using it, it's now a garden shed for your lawnmower. Some other interesting and innovative things. This is a folding roof observatory, but the roof actually opens like this, right? So these are concrete counterweights. So he lifts this hatch out. He folds down his gables, kind of like mine, and then he releases a latch that holds the side of the roof together, and it just opens like a flower. And he's up and running. Very cool. So that's in New England. So obviously counterweighting is required, and that's what you'll see in a lot of these kind of, there's sheds, and again you'll see dozens and dozens of different variants of this, where the roof may slide off forward on rails or whatever, but this is a very popular type of shed as well. Now this one is, talking about opening like a flower, this one opens even more. So you've got a runoff roof, so the roof rolls off, and because this is a daub, or a split ring, it's kind of hard to see, but it's low, right, like a Dobsonian, you need to have the walls go away so that you can see over the walls, or you're basically looking at it, close to the zenith. You only have about a 45-degree angle centered on the zenith. So in this one, the front wall folds down, and these two walls fold out to 45 degrees, which gives them a pretty wide field of view for this low-slung telescope. This would be a great one for a large Dobsonian, or a split ring, which is kind of loaded around. And of course, domes. This one would probably look familiar to you. So there's a bajillion types of domes, and a lot of commercial domes. Domes are hard to make. Not that, it's not prohibitively hard. Lots of people have made their own dome. It's easier to buy one. They tend to be a little more expensive that way. There are some inexpensive options. The thing I don't like about domes is I don't like looking at the world through a slit. I like to see the entire sky. And it's a little more difficult to automate, and I definitely want to have my roof able to run on and off all by itself. So, but this is a very common option. Yep.
Can you see the whole sky from inside your house?
Sorry?
Can you see the whole sky from inside your house?
When the roof is rolled off.
You roll a roof off your house when you're inside controlling your scope in the backyard?
Oh, well, that's different. When I'm not sitting there taking pictures, I like to see the entire sky. Smart ass. Oh, does it pick that up? I think it's back. Okay. So again, domes, very popular. If you're building your own, which is kind of the theme here, a little more difficult. Now, people have done all sorts of stuff, right? So there's rotating roofs and all sorts of stuff like that, which is a lot easier to build because you're building straight angles. You're not trying to build an actual curved dome. So there's lots of this kind of stuff that people have built as well. And then there's all sorts of variants in between. In this case, this is a runoff roof that happens to be on a roof, right? So this fella has built in his garage, he's got a pier running up from the pad, he's got a staircase, he's got all sorts of stuff. Half his garage is servicing this observatory, but it's up on his roof. It is over his garage, and that eliminates one of the big problems with these kind of things, that if you put an observatory over a house, well, heat rises. So if you heat your house, then that heat is going to rise, and you're going to get a lot of issues with distortions introduced by heat rising from your house. So this is over a garage, so it's not nearly as big an issue. And of course, vibrations, if your pier is on a pad where there's people walking around, you're going to get vibrations as well, especially if you're doing high magnification stuff or imaging. So, my shed is called the Snowy Plains Astronomical Observatory for good reason. Because it generally looks like this by January, if I don't shovel it out fairly often. So, how did I build it? Well, after securing spousal approval, we discovered that a part of my back garden was actually a really, really good location, because this, at the time, was farmer's field to the border with the U.S. Like, it was nothing, or beyond this, which was good. Unfortunately, a while back they built Sage Creek there, so it's no longer quite as nice. But and this tree is gone. It had a very limited lifespan after I took this picture. So first thing to do is figure out where you want it to be, keeping track of where your property line is. This fence is actually on my property, so I knew I was good if I was on that fence line. The neighbor later built a fence that was a foot and a half back, so I've got some space. So we mapped out the property. This is north, so I knew that my roof needed to run off north, because I actually very seldom run my roof all the way off unless I'm looking at Polaris or I'm looking at something that's very north, right? In a lot of cases, the roof is only kind of half off because I'm looking south. So what I did is I bought a shed kit from Revy, a 10 by 10 shed. It was about, the shed itself was under $1,000, but all the rest of the pieces. This thing probably cost me $1,200, front to back. I had a very good exposure, like my house is about here, and the neighbor's house is way over here, so I had a very good southern exposure, east, west, southeast, southwest. And I had some room in my yard, and I had spousal approval. I'm good to go. So I dug a hole. So the telescope I was going to put, I was actually engaged in building a 16-inch telescope on a horseshoe mount when I decided I was going to go for this shed, which didn't eventually end up getting built because of kids. Got busy. But to support that telescope, I actually poured a pad. And this pad was actually, I created a mound of gravel, put some rebar in there, and so the inside of this pad is actually a dome sort of shape. It hasn't really moved in 15 years, which is kind of nice. Now, if you wanted to put a pier in the ground, you have to be careful. If you're putting a pier in the ground, you need to go below the frost line, which I think is 4 feet in Winnipeg. And you need to make sure that you're not using, a lot of people put sonotube down the hole and they pour concrete into the sonotube, which is really bad. What you want to do is you want to dig the hole and pour the concrete into the raw hole so it fills in all those gaps, so there's a lot more force required to jack it out of the ground, which is what frost does to piers. So in my case, it wasn't an issue. I just poured a pad. You see all the concrete here. Concrete plus machine plus water equals a pad. So the shed arrived and promptly got thrown into my garage. The shed arrives as pre-built trusses here and all the other fixins. So first thing to do is to build a platform, a deck, basically. If you can build a deck, you can build an observatory, right? So once I built the deck, we also trenched in some conduit, some PVC pipe for conduit, so we could run network and power to it, and built the shed. I happened to put the telescope in the shed because it would have been very difficult to get the telescope into the shed any other way. So we built the shed, we built the trusses, we attached it all to the base, and then I went around with a circular saw and zip, 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 and cut all the trusses and moved the roof onto the runners in the back. Okay, with the rail and the wheels. I built all that on there after I cut all that off. And you can see here the gable here was cut off and then put aside because that would fold down. And then I trimmed these down a bit so that my roof line was a little lower. So once I did that, I put all the, what was that stuff called, OSB, onto the shed. Here's the gable. Here's the hinges for the gable. So have to be very careful to make sure this all lines up before you finish putting all of this wood on, or else it will not line up. The door, of course, needed to be a small door because it needed to be below this line. And the roof will, of course, slide out over here. On the inside, so I've got, this is garage door rail, and these are 600-pound steel wheels. So they just run along, there's 3 of them, obviously holding the weight of the roof, and they just run along the steel track. And the steel track continues outside. It's one continuous track, sealed at where there's a seam, so when it rains and all the water actually fills up the track, it fills up the track, but it goes outside the shed. So this is the fold-off gable part. It's got a latch here so it doesn't fall off. When it falls down, it's a very bad thing because it tends to rip the hinges off. Not that I would know that. And of course, I've got some safety things here. So this is first light. This is an 8-inch telescope, an 8-inch f10 telescope. So basically, fold this down, roll the roof back, and I'm invisible. So, of course, the prettying up part came later, but that's basically the thing up and running. Later, when I realized that I probably wasn't going to meet my deadline for getting all the telescopes I was building, there was a big, really nice Mars apparition back then that I really wanted to take some pictures of. So eventually I dropped back, punted, put a pier on to the concrete pad. So basically drilled 3 holes in the concrete pad, sunk some threaded rod into it, filled up the holes with concrete, and I put this pier in, just a steel pipe. Matter of fact, I think I got it from somebody in Rust. And at the end of the day, I was up and running with this is an 8-inch Celestron telescope. This is a hot box for my computer, so my computer could be in all year. If it was minus 30 out, the computer was generating enough heat to stay functional, and some of the heat would rise into this box to keep the monitor functioning. So this thing actually ran all winter, and it was connected to a USB hub that ran all the bits and pieces and focuser motors and so on that ran the telescope. So this is with the roof open, obviously, and this is what it looks like with the roof closed. And it was great. I spent a lot of time in it, but then finally kids got the better of me. I found I couldn't stay awake past 10 o'clock, for one thing. So it fell into disuse until I finally said, okay, I'm going to take a hiatus here, and I'm going to sell off all my gear, because then when I get back into it, I can buy nicer gear, right? And the lawnmower is going in the shed. So, and the winter tires. It was winter tires. And about 40 squirrels, 18 rabbits, 8 skunks, a bunch of rats, and a groundhog were living in the shed. So, not long ago, and actually it's probably 2018 versus 2019, I decided, okay, kids are older, my kids are teenagers, they don't want to hang out with dad and mom anyway, so I'm going to have a lot more time to spend, so I'm going to reactivate my shed. So, out comes the pine cone collection in a container like this. Had to replace some wood. Obviously, the stain, it needed to be stained and prettied up. But generally, it just needed, a couple of pieces of wood needed to be replaced, but generally it had survived not too bad. And I had to re-level these runners because things had shifted a little bit on these cottage blocks. Got a new EQG mount, got a C8, and basically instead of upgrading I ended up with pretty much the same thing I had before, except with an EQG instead of a CG file. So a little bit of an upgrade. So the sad observatory became a happy observatory, and here it is as it is today. I really went all out on my my pier. Does anybody know what those are?
Leveling bolts?
Pardon?
Leveling bolts?
This is bricks.
Yeah, no, those are rotors from a Dodge Minivan. They are solid, they're heavy. So I welded them to the pier. So that sucker doesn't move. The important thing about this pier, though, is it's isolated from the building. You'll notice I had that pad, and that pad was completely isolated from the building. There was no part of the building touching it. So when I walk around in my shed, the telescope doesn't move, right? It doesn't bounce, which is a downside of some observatories where your telescope is actually touching the building because it transmits vibrations from you walking around and so on. So I can walk around in my shed, no problem. Doesn't cause any vibrations. I can be taking pictures while I'm walking around. Doesn't matter. So this is close enough to my house. The wireless extends out to it with an extender. So I can be sitting in my house running the telescope, or I can be sitting in the shed. Depending on what the mosquito situation, obviously the thermocell helps with that, and how long it's going to take and so on. So this is basically the workflow. I walk out, I put a key in the padlock, I take the padlock off, open the doors, drop or power up the pier, basically plug in one plug and it's all powered up. Drop the gable, roll off the roof, check everything's up and running and going out. Or sit here and use it from a console here. So this is my C8. It's on a Orion Sirius EQG mount. It's got a Canon 1100D as an imager. It's got an off-axis guider with a Orion Starshoot guider. All that plugs into a powered USB hub, and it's all run by a Raspberry Pi 4B, which if you were at my presentation last weekend, you know what that is. If you don't, sorry. It's basically a single board computer that runs all my astronomy software, so I can connect to it with a keyboard and mouse, or I connect to it through a remote desktop type thing. If I happen to be in the observatory, I can use a wireless joypad to actually run the telescope. It has all of the buttons on the joypad are all mapped to different things, so I can change slew speeds. 1 and 2 are my focuser, all that kind of stuff. So, and that's all ECOS, in K-stars and stellar main. All that is run from that. So it works really well. I'm really happy with it. It was easy to put together. It was not expensive, obviously, but it works pretty well. So, future plans. I do want to run, I'm using wireless. I do have a conduit run that I can run a cable through, and I'll run a cable through so I can get faster networking. Flip-off covers on the rails because it's keeping them clean in the middle of winter is sometimes an exercise. I also considered you can buy strip that are basically a bunch of resistors. You can buy strip to heat your roof to keep the snow off it. So I was going to embed that underneath the rails. But then I figured, okay, well, that uses power, and then I have to, turn it off and on and all that sort of thing. So what I'll do is I'm just going to have a couple of spring-loaded covers that when the roof starts rolling back, it's got a wedge, it just pushes them aside and rolls on and rolls on. Pretty easy stuff. I need to replace that heavy, hot roof with something a little lighter because it is very heavy. So if I want to automate it, it means the motor is working a lot harder than it needs to. Plus it gets really hot in that shed. When it's very hot outside, it gets really hot in the shed. And of course, all the equipment heats up and then it takes a long time to cool down. So I want to keep it as cool as possible, so I want to have something that's not black or dark. Finish the interior, add some weather detectors, so I can, when I actually start it all up and running, walk away, I can just go to bed, and it does its thing, and then it closes itself when it's done, or when it detects the fact there's going to be some adverse weather. So that means I need to automate the roll-off. A lot of people are using these things. These things are the things that, the gates that slide. These are the motors people are using for sliding those gates. Perfectly suited for this application. Garage door openers work too, but this one seems to be the easiest thing to implement, so probably something like that. So that's next year. Any questions? Yo.
You said that you have it automatically open and close. I noticed the scope sticks up, so I guess it would have to somehow come down to close.
That is an interesting engineering problem that I'm still thinking about.
What was the question?
If I'm going to automate the roof rolling back and forth, what do I do about the gable folding up and down?
Oh, yeah.
There's probably a very complicated pulley system that would make that happen, or a separate motor. Right? I haven't decided yet. I have relay boards that fit on top of my Pis and Arduinos and all that kind of stuff that can turn motors off and on, so I'm not too worried about it. Whatever will be easier at the time. Or I don't even bother to fold it down, I just leave it, and then I reduce my southern exposure, but Sage Creek is there now, so I'm not really as anxious to get down to the horizon in the south. Yeah?
Where did you find a commercial door opener for your gable?
I'm sorry, I'm hard of hearing, so you have to yell.
A commercial door opener for your gable? Maybe from, I don't know, Habitat?
Yep. Yep. The question is, will I bother? I guess. Any other questions? Yeah?
How does your mount work in the middle of winter for tracking?
Well, this one I haven't had out in the middle of winter. The CG5, I actually ripped apart the CG5, re-greased it with lithium, and it would be good to about minus 10 or 15. So yeah, minus 35, nothing works, including me. I don't work under minus 15 either, so it's all actually fairly convenient because the telescope doesn't either. I did try to use it minus 25, and yeah, things didn't go so well. So at a certain point, we have to bow to the fact we live in an icebox. Any other questions? I'm keeping you here late because you were late coming back. So. Yep.
Do you find you get condensation on your telescope?
Like dew?
Do you outside?
Yes.
Oh yeah. Well, it's not too bad because the whole roof, it's not like being outside, right? Like during the day,
Right, yeah.
it hasn't been a problem during the day, but of course at night you get dew, right? So I used to have dew heaters. I'm actually thinking of making some, but yeah, I'll either buy or make some. It hasn't been a big problem so far, but it's been short bursts of activity with this lately. So, any other? No? So, well, what are some mistakes that people make? The one I see a lot is this kind of thing, where you have to be an acrobatic gnome to actually be able to use your telescope, right? Because I can't fit in there, so I'm not really sure, I guess you could sort of worm your way in there and if you're kind of acrobatic, be able to look through your eyepiece, but a lot of these things are just too small. right? Seriously, with a 10 by 10 shed, it's still sometimes not enough room, especially when you get all your crap in there. So definitely you want to think about not only storing your telescope, but if you're going to have it all fold away so you can use it, you want to make sure you can actually use your telescope. So as I said, you want to isolate your pier from the pad. So while you're contorting around this telescope, trying to get a look through the eyepiece, you're also bumping it, and it's not a very stable platform that way. Consider what's going to happen in the winter. So if you are planning on using it into the minuses, you want to make sure that your mount is capable of operating. You will use it in colder temperatures because you don't have to drag it out to your backyard, so you will want to use it. You want to make sure it's capable of being used. And like I said, one of the things I did with my CG5 is I completely winterized it. And it worked a lot better. So, be aware of present and future issues with location, like trees that are small when you build it, might be big when you're 10 years later. And your wife may not let you cut them down, like you did the first one. So there are some bushes kind of encroaching, but they're covering up Sage Creek, so I'm okay with them. My wife is here, by the way, so she's getting a look into my brain. People have a lot of trouble with zoning, and people have more trouble with like homeowners associations if they live in an area that has a homeowner association that have rules around what they can build. Sometimes they build their observatory and the homeowners association comes and says, take that thing down, that's not appropriate for our area, right? For Winnipeg, if you have something under 108 square feet, you don't have to get a permit. So you might want to make sure that your building's under 108 square feet. Ensure you have enough power to get to the observatory, so you do want to run power. Running an extension cable to your house gets old really quickly, so get an electrician to come and put power in, get a permit. Make security a primary design criteria. So I learned how good my security was when I left my son's welder in the shed, and he simply unscrewed the hinges of the door and took it out when he wanted to get it. So now my doors are quite a bit more secure. So make sure security, you're going to put a lot of stuff in there, it's going to be expensive stuff, make sure security is a primary criteria. I do have an alarm in there, so when the door came off, I got my phone beeped and told me, and I have cameras on it, but yeah, I needed to solve that one security issue. The really cool thing is what I got screws you can only turn one way, right? So you put those suckers in, they're never coming out again, because you can screw them this way, but they don't have the slot in them to screw them the other way, so they go in and they can never come out. So that kind of stuff you have to think about. Critter proofing, I'm still working on. The critters liked their house, and they didn't want to give it up. So it's now a fairly pitched battle that we're fighting. And you know, every method of ingress they discover, I close, and they find another one, and I close, because they're like critters, right? It doesn't matter all that much. They don't get into the shed. They get under the shed, is where they like to be. It's going to get to a point where I'm going to live and let live and say, okay, you're not a skunk, you can live under the shed. So, but try to critter proof. Screens are good. What I've got is on the sides of the thing, I've got basically 2x6s buried in the earth, down to a certain depth to keep them from digging in and that kind of stuff. So you just have to plan for it. And again, critters are going to be critters, so at a certain point it's good enough. And plan for the future. That 5-inch SCT may be a 24-inch RCT one day, right? So you want to plan for something bigger than you have now. So lots of commercial options. Building your backyard observatory, didn't want to go into them too much. How many people here have pods and things? Quite a few? One? Really? Oh, a couple, okay. Yeah. And domes and stuff, I know we have some fairly sophisticated astronomical compounds out there.
Don't buy more than the crap.
So,
don't buy, which one? Explorer Dome.
Explorer Dome?
Control.
Well, obviously, this is just a sampling. Some of these are from away, but some of them are really cool. The Astrohaven clamshells look expensive, but they're cool. The Astrodome is from Australia, but they're kind of cool. And pulsars look kind of plastic pottish, kind of, except with a more traditional dome. So there are a lot of commercial options. So if you just want to buy a solution and have it installed and up and running quickly, certainly there's tons and tons and tons, including SkyShed's a Canadian company. And they not only do the pods, I think they do the pods, right? But they'll also come and build a nice shed like this for you. Or they'll give you plans and send you a kit. So if you don't quite want to roll your own like I did, this is a good option for you, but you're going to pay for it. So as always, some neat books. This is a great one. It's brand new. It's very, very recent, very topical. This series from the Practical Astronomy series, there's some good stuff in here. This is the worst astronomical observatory book ever made. But it's actually a decent book because it's not only how to build an observatory, it's how to build a telescope. It goes right from, it talks about grinding mirrors, it talks about building telescopes, it talks about different, it's really a end-to-end comprehensive look at telescopes, and it happens to have a chapter with observatories in it, right? So it's not, the name is not descriptive, but it is relatively modern. It's got dogs and things in it, much more modern than this one. So for the sort of nostalgia, these two are pretty good. But I would say if you're going to get one to start dreaming about building your own observatory, this would be the one. Questions? Oh, hey, look at that. So if you do build a runoff shed, try not to make it look like an outhouse too much, or someone may leave you a present. No questions? Ready for pizza? Thank you very much.